Okay, in part two, we're going to take a slightly different look at the nature of microbes. So in part one, we talk a lot about some generalities as to what they are, what is microbiology itself. In part two, we're going to talk more about the nature of how microbes work in terms of their ability to cause disease, their interaction with other microbes, you and I as humans. And then we're going to talk a little bit more towards the end about the current trends related to infection and disease. So those are some of the things that we're going to be looking at. The list of topics: microbes and symbiosis. This relates to how they form relationships with themselves and other organisms. The nature and severity of pathogens. So we're going to take a look at some of the different categories of pathogens and kind of go through the differences between them. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the new information that's come out related to microbiology over the last couple of years and how that can relate to you and I and just our everyday life. It's actually quite interesting. I got a topic here called New Links to Old Microbes. This is essentially a connection between diseases that have already been established, but understanding better what actually causes them. So in other words, not revealing a new disease itself, but a new cause or potential underlying cause of that disease. We're going to talk about emerging diseases, which are diseases that have yet to be seen or diseases that have gone away and may be reoccurring. And then lastly, we'll talk about antibiotic resistance, which is obviously the ability of bacteria and microbes to become no longer susceptible to the drugs that we use to try and treat them. Unfortunately, this is a rapidly increasing issue, one that doesn't appear to be getting any better, and one that, best case scenario, will get much worse before it gets better. So hopefully there will be a solution at some point, but before that ever happens, the situation is going to get worse. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk a little bit about what's responsible for that and what's currently being done and what's currently not being done. Okay, so with all that in mind, let's go ahead and take a look at the first part of Chapter 1, Part 2. Okay, so Chapter 1, Part 2. We're going to start with microbes and symbiosis. So one of the things about microbes that's been discovered over the past several decades is that they tend to not live in isolation, meaning they actually form associations with other living organisms. This could be other microbes, this could be plants, this could be you and I as humans, and virtually every other type of organism. So we refer to these as a symbiotic relationship. So a symbiotic or symbiotic, however you want to pronounce that. So what is a symbiotic relationship? We can define it several ways. Let's go with the textbook definition here. I'm going to read it word for word for you. This is the definition of symbiosis, which is the same thing. It's defined as an intimate association between individuals from two species. I'll repeat that. An intimate association between individuals from two species. You can look that up in the back of the book if you need to. So basically, it's a relationship between two different species. Okay, that's the idea of a symbiotic relationship. So when it comes to microbes, these symbiotic relationships become very relevant as they relate to you and I as humans. So rather than talk about all the different types, we'll focus here on the symbiotic relationships between microbes and humans. So you may already know this, but to point this out, you and I as humans, we have literally trillions of microbes in and on our bodies. Now, most of these microbes, the vast majority, are actually found in our gut. It's actually the large intestine or the colon where the vast majority of those trillions of microbes live. They say you have something like 6 pounds of gut bacteria inside of your colon. So if you were to take that out, you'd be about 6 pounds lighter. Now, a lot of this is still ongoing. I mentioned in part one that in the introduction that microbiology is a rapidly developing field. And what that just basically means is like many things today, kind of like social media and the internet and computer technology, everything is rapidly advancing piggybacking on the inventions and the technological innovations that are coming from all different areas. Advancements in genetic studies is a big one when it comes to microbiology, being able to study the genetic nature of microbes, as well as us as humans, being able to understand the genetic code better has helped us understand microbes better. Better culture methods has helped. Also, just the insight that there's a need to look at these microbes. So for many years, they weren't even attempting to study them. So key studies have shown that there's a good reason to even begin these studies. And so just by sheer virtue of thinking to even look at the nature of these microbes, they've learned quite a bit. So there's a combination of many factors here. But what are some of the things that they've learned? And these are all things that are fairly well established. And we'll get into some of the newer, more fringe areas here in a bit. Some of the things that microbes do, or some of the roles they play as part of these symbiotic relationships. Microbes are known to aid in our digestion. This has actually been known for quite some time. However, it's becoming more clear as to what that exactly means and to what extent they do this. But they actually help you break down your food. Now, this varies from person to person. Each of us have a different gut makeup, gut bacteria makeup, and that can lead to better or worse rates of digestion. But they do help you break down parts of your food. It's been known that microbes aid in the development of our immune system. Absent key species in the gut at the time of your early development, you might lead to certain autoimmune diseases. Could lead to incomplete gut development. They've actually shown this in mice that were raised without complete sets of gut bacteria. And they found that the intestines, for example, wouldn't quite completely develop without some of those bacteria. They've been shown to synthesize vitamins and even neurotransmitters. They've actually even been shown to break down neurotransmitters, and there's research suggesting that serotonin deficiencies, which can cause depression, might actually be caused by certain gut bacteria. Also, anxiety and things like that could be caused by a lack of other neurotransmitters that are known to help with focus and concentration. So they're starting to show, although not prove, there's nothing been proven yet, but they're starting to show pretty compelling evidence that there's at least the potential for microbes to affect the ability of your brain to function properly. For many years, there's been what's known as the gut-brain connection. So in other words, they knew that what you ate and the overall health of your gut would affect your mentality and your mood and your even intelligence and things like that. No one really knew why. They just knew there was a connection. And now they're starting to realize that almost certainly that connection is mostly due to the gut bacteria and the variable effects that they're having there. So that part has been pretty well established. The big question is to just what extent is that happening? And the truth is every person is going to be a little different, so it's hard to come up with consistencies here. So a lot of this is generalization based on some of the latest research. Lastly here, microbes are also known to prevent other harmful microbes from causing infection. So you have what you call your good bacteria, and they're kind of like little protective soldiers in your gut. And it's harder for the quote-unquote bad bacteria to come in and cause harm when you have a good bacteria that's flourishing in the gut. So as I mentioned in Chapter 1, Part 1, not all microbes are bad. I said many are beneficial. There's a prime example of beneficial bacteria, the quote-unquote good gut bacteria that prevent harmful ones from coming in. Okay, now symbiosis is, as we said, an association between two different species. Now this happens in all different contexts. There's a million different examples you come up with here. But from a broader standpoint, you actually have several different types of symbiotic relationships. The more common association here, the more common type of symbiotic relationship is what we call a mutual symbiotic relationship. So just to clarify, to give you the overview here, there's actually three different types of symbiotic relationships. So what we call a mutual, commensal, and a parasitic symbiotic relationship. So in a mutual, the idea is that the relationship benefits both organisms. Now this is kind of like the idea behind a marriage between two people, that you get married and you share benefits and you share bills and you share living space and you help each other out. And by joining together, you both benefit from that relationship. A commensal relationship is one where it's almost it's probably not the best example. It's almost like a child and a parent. It's probably not the best example, but in this scenario, one benefits and the other is neutral. Now, speaking strictly, maybe monetarily or just from a physical standpoint, in this sense, a commensal relationship, one organism gets a clear benefit from the relationship, but the other is unaffected. So like in a parent-child, again, not the best example, but the child clearly benefits from the parent, and the parent doesn't necessarily benefit from the child, although that's obviously not true, right? But the idea is that there's a kind of a one-way street where one of the two benefits and the other is more or less neutral. So they're not affected in any way, shape, or form, but the other is in a beneficial way. That's what we call a commensal symbiotic relationship. And then the last is what you call a parasitic symbiotic relationship. And really a parasitic symbiotic relationship is just where one organism is benefiting at the detriment of the other. So this is often the nature of infection. So really what you have when it comes to an infection or a pathogen is you have an organism that is associating in a negative way with another organism. And there is an association there, but it's not a good one, at least for one of the two. So take, for example, an infection in the gut by a bad bacteria. What's happening there is a microbe is establishing an association with you inside of your gut. Now that association benefits the microbe. It's getting nutrients and a space to grow, presumably. So the microbe, the pathogen, is actually benefiting, but is doing so at the cost of your health and well-being. So that's what we call a parasitic relationship or a parasitic symbiotic relationship. And just to clarify there, that's really the case when it comes to all infections. An infection is really just a relationship gone awry. If you look at the difference between good bacteria in the gut, continuing with that example, good gut bacteria and bad gut bacteria, the difference really is just how they interact with the host. Some bacteria are considered quote-unquote good simply because their interaction doesn't cause harm. And another microbe may be considered bad because that type of interaction ultimately causes a negative effect. It's kind of like how two people can have a negative relationship, but one of those two people can go on and have a positive relationship with somebody else. And we find this to be the case with lots of bacteria. So bacteria may have a negative association in one host, maybe a positive association in another host. So we'll have examples to talk about throughout the semester here. But this often happens when microbes are transferred from animals to people or vice versa, where an animal might harbor a bacteria with no consequence, but when it enters into the human body, that same relationship can actually become toxic and harmful. So that's the idea behind the symbiosis relationships that microbes have. The truth is, while we have three categories, the reality is that there's really more of a continuum here. Things are not always quite so black and white. There's always a shifting degree between one or the other. I should say there isn't always, but there can be. So, for example, a commensal relationship in the middle, they're kind of neutral in most cases, can actually become parasitic or maybe even beneficial. So what is considered beneficial today may ultimately become harmful or vice versa. So we tend to categorize these as we see them at any given point in time, but it's important to note that things change for a wide variety of reasons. So we don't want to get into what those reasons might be because that's a little harder to say and it's more specific to each context. But just to point out that while we have three categories, the truth is there's a lot of leeway in between those, and it's not always obvious as to which one is which. Okay, so this slide and the next are just a recap real quick from Chapter 1, Part 1. We talked about pathogens, what those are, how many approximately are known. That number will continue to change, by the way. It probably already is somewhat outdated, just a basic approximation there. We also talked about microbes, pathogens that we classify based on the body location, or at least I should say the infection that they cause based on the body location of the body systems affected. So next here, building on that, I want to talk a little bit about the two general categories that pathogens will fall into. So it says, what are these two groups? What are the two groups that pathogens can be loosely categorized into? So the two groups, they're very broad groups, I'll pull them up here. They are what we call opportunistic pathogens and primary pathogens, which sometimes also are referred to as true pathogens. So primary and or true pathogens. These are the two groups, I should say. So opportunistic and primary or true pathogens. These are just alternate ways of saying the same thing. Okay, so that's what the two groups are. And I'll go back to that. What are the differences between them? What's the next question there? The more significant part. We'll start with the primary pathogens down here. Primary pathogens are pathogens that are adapted to avoid the host immune system. So as a result, they have the ability to infect healthy individuals. There's a lot more we could say about primary pathogens, but that really cuts straight to the point of it without a lot of the fluff around it. Primary pathogens are considered primary or true because they have adaptations that allow them to infect, in theory, almost anybody. There's a lot of gray area there. It definitely matters how well you take care of yourself, and it definitely matters how old you are and what kind of food you eat. So I don't want to act like it's that simple. But in a general sense, these microbes have adaptations to avoid the host immune system, which, to clarify, is what keeps you healthy. So the idea is that even when you're healthy, relatively speaking, these microbes can kind of wiggle in between, so to speak, the immune functions that you have that would otherwise eliminate most pathogens. We'll talk about examples as we go throughout the semester about what adaptations that might be, what microbes those might be, and what ways in which they avoid the immune system. So I don't want to try and get too much into the details so we can keep moving here, but that's the idea. Contrast that with an opportunistic pathogen. Opportunistic pathogens lack adaptations to avoid the host immune system. So basically the opposite there. So as a result of this, sorry for that. As a result of this, they tend to only infect individuals with a quote-unquote weakened immune system. I put that in quotes because the truth is what that means is somewhat subjective depending on the context. So in a true sense, a weakened immune system, I'll give you some examples here, what this really means in a more technical sense. Someone with a weakened immune system, for example, would be children under 5 years old. Before the age of 5, approximately speaking, your immune system just isn't fully developed. And even after the age of 5, it takes longer than that. Usually your immune system takes up until about the age of puberty to fully develop. So up until that age, you're a little bit more susceptible, but especially under the age of 5. So this is one of the reasons why kids tend to get sick more often early in life than they do later. Their immune system, just by nature, has not developed. That doesn't mean there's anything wrong with it. It's just the way we all start out in life. This applies in the reverse sense to the elderly. Now, this varies depending on how healthy you are and what kind of life decisions you've made. So there's certainly not nearly as quite a defined number here. 5 years tends to be fairly well pretty specific to most people. With the elderly, it's certainly more general, but I would say, generally speaking, 65 plus, again, depending on how healthy you are. But around that age, for a lot of people, the ability to fight off infection gets harder and harder. So age is a big aspect of a weakened immune system. And that's more from a natural standpoint, from just early and late life and late in life. Other examples would be, in today's world, untreated HIV / really AIDS. If you have the acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, you have an inability to fight off infection. So that's a common one there, untreated HIV and AIDS. Other individuals who have a weakened immune system would be chemotherapy patients. Those undergoing chemotherapy have their immune system really wiped out by the chemo, which is designed to kill rapidly dividing cells, such as cancer cells. So chemo is designed to kill cancer cells. The unfortunate side effect is that it also kills your immune cells, which are also rapidly dividing. So you target rapidly dividing cells, which are the cancer cells, but then consequentially you also kill your immune cells. You'll also end up killing hair cells and stomach cells, which are also rapidly dividing. Many others also, but those are the ones that you tend to notice. And this is why chemotherapy patients tend to lose their hair, and they tend to get sick to their stomach and have a hard time eating, because they're wiping out other cells that are also rapidly dividing along with the chemo. There's more examples in this, but I'll leave the last one I'll put on here would be organ transplant patients. And the reason they are considered to have a weakened immune system is because they are given immunosuppressant drugs. Given immunosuppressant drugs to suppress the immune system so that the body doesn't reject the organ. So the only way you can actually have an organ transplant that's successful is to suppress the immune system intentionally with drugs to prevent rejection of the organ. So by nature of the operation, they are intentionally suppressed. Their immune system is intentionally suppressed, so they become immune compromised. I use that word, let me clarify. These are all what we consider these are all what we would consider as a group here immunocompromised individuals. Spell right there. Individuals. So they're all different, but what they all have in common is that they have a weakened immune system. So to clarify, certain pathogens, considered opportunistic pathogens, really don't make most people sick. We come in contact with them on a routine basis often, and we never know it because our immune system fights them off before they ever get a chance to make us sick. It's only when our immune system becomes reduced and dysfunctional that we actually start to have a higher and higher probability of these microbes making us sick. Now, there's many other cases that might make you immune compromised, especially in certain parts of the body. An example would be like smoking would make you more susceptible to respiratory infection. So I didn't include every aspect of it here, but those are the most common examples of immune compromised individuals and those who would be susceptible to opportunistic pathogens. The rest, primary pathogens, it's again, I said earlier, it's not to say that being healthy doesn't matter, because it definitely does. Some people are super healthy, they exercise every day, they eat really good foods, they take vitamins, and they never get sick. So they have a heightened ability to fight off infection. So I'm saying this in a more very general sense without going into every detail. But in general, primary pathogens, they're able to make healthy people sick due to the ability to avoid the immune system. Now, we won't really come back to that until later when we get to chapters 13, 14, and 15. So we will come back to it, but it'll be a little bit later in the semester. But we will talk at some point about what those adaptations are and a little bit more about how that works. Okay, I'm going to move on here. So if you need to go ahead and pause this and finish writing that down, go ahead and do that now. I'm going to go back to where we left off here. Okay, so those are the two general types of pathogens. Now, one of the other interesting things about pathogens I want to talk about next is that pathogens often vary by the host in which they're associated with. So what that essentially means is that going back to the idea of a symbiotic relationship, sometimes the pathogenic nature is due to the actual interaction with the host and not necessarily the pathogen itself. So in other words, a pathogen may only actually cause harm in a certain host and not harm in other hosts. So it's not universally pathogenic, it's more specifically pathogenic. An example of this is a microbe that causes cat scratch fever. You may have heard of this. I'll pull up something here on it real quick. So cat scratch fever comes from a parasite called Bartonella hensleyi. It's a type of microbe often carried in the saliva and the nails, often in the cracks and crevices of the nails of a cat, and doesn't really affect the cat. It has no real toxic effect on the cat whatsoever. But if the cat bites an individual or scratches an individual, that bacteria can get into the human body where it can have a negative interaction with the human body. So its pathogenic nature has more to do with the way it interacts with people than it does the actual pathogen itself. Okay, so you're kind of splitting hairs there, but the idea is that in a cat, it doesn't really cause any problems. But if you get that same microbe into a person, then it actually does cause infection, or at least it certainly can and often does. So there's a lot of reasons why this takes place. Again, a lot of these are specific to each scenario, so I try and provide some examples here without trying to go through all of them, obviously. Sometimes it has to do with the host immune system. Some hosts have different levels of susceptibility. It can be the way the body interacts in general. Maybe the tissue, could be the immune system, could be could be other various factors such as other bacteria, other microbes in the body. Could be part of the diet. It could be the way that certain dietary substances interact with these microbes. The truth is, a lot of times they don't always know. It's not always obvious why. It's a lot easier to diagnose an infection, to say that an infection is present, than to say exactly why that infection is present. So it's just to clarify, we know that there are certain things that happen, but it's not always obvious what exactly that difference that makes one susceptible versus the other is. So when it comes to infection, one of the things that often happens is you have microbes that are carried by one organism and then transferred to another, and then suddenly the change of interaction becomes toxic. And that's when we say you got infected. But the truth is, it's just really kind of the passage of a good relationship to a bad relationship, if that makes any sense. So this is a pretty common way that microbes cause infection. They have a good relationship, and then they're transferred, and then that relationship sours, and we call that an infection. The other way that microbes become infectious is we pick them up from the environment. So that's, some microbes from the soil, for example, they don't ever get transferred necessarily. We just pick them up from the environment. So a good example of this would be like tetanus. The microbe that causes tetanus is one that you often get from the soil, and it doesn't necessarily change hosts in a negative way. You just pick it up, and it automatically has a negative association with your body. So tetanus is one you might get from the environment. Now, this next slide here I find really, really interesting. This comes from a project we'll talk about later in the semester called the Human Microbiome Project. It's a project that set out to determine the nature of the human microbiome, meaning what are the different types of microbes in the human body in terms of the species, what are the different species present, and then what role do some of those species have in the human body. So basically just trying to study really specifically the microbes that are found in and on the human body. And one of the most fascinating things that they found was that all the people, so just let me back up here real quick, they didn't study sick people, which is what they traditionally have done in microbiology. That's a really key, important insight there. So in the past, what they would do, which made sense, it was they would take somebody who was sick and they would look to see, why are you sick? And then they would come up with an answer. They would eventually figure out it's this virus, or it's this bacteria, or it's this protozoa, or whatever it is. So they would wait for the symptoms and then look for the cause, which again makes perfect sense. That's exactly what you would want to do in most cases. But what hadn't really been done until around the time of the Human Microbiome Project was to just study healthy people and just see what's going on there. What kind of microbes do we have? What's there? What's not there? And what they started to find out, which again no one had looked for, was that they actually had harmful pathogens in their body at the time that they were studied, even though they were perfectly healthy. And this was a huge revelation because people just hadn't looked for that. They didn't know that that was the case. So they found that virtually everybody studied carried harmful microbes in their body somewhere, often in the gut, but they weren't sick. They didn't have symptoms. There was no indication of any infection. So what this kind of elucidated was an idea that not all infections originate from the outside world as a transfer or picking up something from the environment. Sometimes it's now recognized that something internally changes. Your diet changes. You have stress. You maybe aren't sleeping good enough. Probably a combination of all three of those things, right? So, I'm kind of just speculating here. No one really knows exactly, but these are the speculations here that it's not so much you were infected, it's that your body changed internally, and there was something that was disturbed in terms of a balance. And so the microbe that was there, but wasn't causing harm at one point in time, something suddenly shifts, and that microbe suddenly starts to cause a problem. Most likely what's happening is the balance of microbes is really important. So some microbes are potentially harmful, but only if they are too numerous in the body. So as long as you have a small number of them, then they don't really cause an issue. It's only when you have a high percentage or a higher percentage than normal that those microbes might become harmful. Imagine if you had a room with 100 people and you had one person in that room who was super hyperactive and ADHD to the extreme, couldn't sit down, couldn't sit still, just bouncing off the walls. That one person out of 100 may not have a huge disruption on everybody else in the room, although it'd be a slight one. But because it was such a small percentage of the overall whole, if everybody else is calm and relatively sedate, it may not be a big issue. Now imagine if half the people in the room have severe ADHD and are bouncing off the walls. Imagine how that changes the entire context of the environment. So the overall balance between one microbe and the next can be the difference between health and disease. Not necessarily an outside exposure, but an internal shift. And that's one of the things that has been elucidated recently. It just simply wasn't looked at. It was just simply completely overlooked in the past. So that's kind of talking about that here. We're looking at the relationship here between microbes and humans. So what this study is doing, as I already mentioned, there is this kind of looking at all the different aspects of our human microbiome and the human microbe relationship there. As I kind of mentioned there, it's not just when we're sick or diseased, but the overall everyday function of our body that microbes can have an impact on. There's a question in the study guide about this, so look for that. But there's an analogy that's been coined, not by myself, but by other scientists much smarter than myself, and they said that our gut bacteria, the way to think about it in terms of kind of helping you understand what those are really doing, is to think about our gut bacteria as really a separate organ. And now it's not like any other organ in your body, but you can think of it like that way. The gut bacteria collectively function in some equivalency to an organ in your body. So just like any other organ, if you don't take care of it, if you have the wrong diet, if you're not doing whatever you need to do to keep yourself healthy, exercising, sleeping, etc., certain organs can become diseased and not function properly, just like we already well know. So the gut bacteria, when you think about it that way, it kind of makes sense as to how that helps your overall body. The difference is it's a changing, dynamic organ, one that doesn't stay fixed. It is constantly shifting. So your diet, for example, can change that organ over time in a way. It changes it much more dramatically than any other organ, right? So it's kind of a loose analogy, but I think it's one that it makes sense to me anyway, that our gut bacteria collectively really play a significant role to the extent that we can think of them as like a separate organ. So the other perspective to take on this is that you can really think of the gut bacteria as like separate little passengers in your body that you have to take care of in order for them to function properly. It's like a living organ, a separate living organ in your body. And not only do you have to take care of your own organs in your own body, but you have to take care of this separate living organ inside along with everything else. So these microbes, they don't go away, and you don't necessarily want them to go away. Our goal is not to get rid of them. Our goal is to facilitate them to function at their ideal rate, or their ideal, I should say, under optimal conditions, we'll say. The truth is they affect you whether you realize it or not. So these have been there throughout human history. We just didn't know about it until very recently. And now we're starting to figure out that these are probably what's responsible for certain diseases and disorders and things of that nature, which have always been there. We just didn't know what caused them. So this has an effect, what we do has an effect, such as what we eat is a big one. Antibiotics that we take every once in a while are now shown to have a huge impact on our gut bacteria, and oftentimes in a negative way. Other medications perhaps may have a role. I don't know how much of research really has shown that. It's more of a speculation there. Certainly antibiotics, though. And the people and other animals we come in contact with, I've seen studies that have shown that people and their pets over time will start to share bacteria. So you and your pet will have similar strains of bacteria from presumably from contact with each other. Microbes have short lifespans, so they're constantly regenerating. So the gut bacteria and the other bacteria in your body, whatever you have today is really a consequence of what you've been doing over the last several months. So if you've had bad habits for the last several months, your gut bacteria are going to change in response to that. So it's not enough to just be healthy for a short period of time. You have to actually consistently maintain a healthy gut bacteria in order to reap those benefits. So they don't live very long, and they're constantly regenerating. So the food that you eat is going to constantly put different gut bacteria into your body. It's also going to facilitate the growth of different types of gut bacteria. And over time, that's going to change depending on the habits that you have, which is just like anything else, as far as your body weight and your stamina and things like that. But in this context, it relates directly to the gut bacteria. So an example of that, and it's something you could actually implement today and that would benefit you if you wanted to, would be in relationship to the gut bacteria and fiber. So for many years, we have known that a high fiber diet is good for you. Lots of leafy green vegetables, ideally. Even though nobody likes to eat them, or very few of us do, we know it's good for us. But what they're finding out now is a little bit more about why that's good for us. Now, there's lots of reasons. So I'm not saying this is the only reason. But in relation to the gut bacteria, one of the reasons why they're finding that fiber is good for you is that it actually is a better food source for the quote-unquote beneficial bacteria. So our quote-unquote good bacteria, they actually like to eat fiber. And when we give them fiber, they grow and their population goes up. And our gut bacteria has lots of good strains that go along with that. Alternatively, sugars, especially simple sugars, corn syrup being the worst, but really any simple high sugar food tends to be a better food source for the bad bacteria. So strains of bacteria that tend to be more negative on the body, they actually flourish more off of the refined simple sugars, sodas and sweets and things like that. So over time, a high sugar, low fiber diet is actually going to cultivate more bad strains of bacteria and fewer strains of good bacteria. And then oppositely, a high fiber, low sugar diet is going to cultivate more strains of good bacteria and fewer of bad. Now, once again, these things don't exist in a vacuum. So we're talking generalities here. Everybody's a little bit different. Your own genetics have a major impact on these things as well. So again, it's very general here, but the idea is that you can have a big impact on your gut bacteria simply by the amount of fiber that you take into your body and the amount of sugar that you take into your body. So if you go back to thinking about almost like eating for two, almost like you're carrying a child, the truth is you're feeding those gut bacteria with every meal that you take in, whether you realize it or not. So whether you're conscious, you're doing it. So over time, the type of food you eat cultivates different strains of bacteria. And the bad bacteria, they've been shown to affect our mood in a negative way. They've been shown to make us retain weight in a negative way. And probably other things, maybe they can lead to gut cancer. That's certainly a real likely possibility that's been shown. They can ultimately cause intestinal issues of various types. Crohn's disease, another example. Ulcers, possibly. I'll talk about that one next year, actually. So when I say bad, there's a lot of things that means. Good bacteria tend to help our mood, tend to help our digestion, tend to prevent some of these negative things. At least that's the current speculation. Again, this is newer research. So what you eat is not only good for your own body, but good for your gut bacteria. And so that's how I like to think about eating these days, is I am eating for two. And I don't always eat healthy, by the way, but I do tend to eat more healthy foods because I'm constantly reminded that of why that's beneficial, that the fibers are specifically good for the bacteria in the gut. Here's an example of a microbe that can cause a stomach issue if it becomes too numerous in the body. This one is called H. pylori. H stands for helico. Let me write that down here for you. So H stands for Helicobacter pylori. Helicobacter pylori looks kind of like this. It's a microbe that can get into the gut and cause damage into the epithelial layers as it burrows deeper and deeper. Here's a nice image of that. It actually releases compounds which damage some of the gastric mucosa there over time. So this is one that is now recognized to cause stomach ulcers, gastric ulcers. This was only discovered in the early 90s, been a little bit of time now, but not that long ago. So what they found was that something like 80 to 90% of people that have a stomach ulcer have it as a result of this particular bacteria. And prior to that, they thought most ulcers were caused by poor diet and sleep habits and stress and things like that, which is probably not entirely wrong. It turns out that those factors cause a change in your gut bacteria. At least that seems what is most likely happening. So it's a scenario where the gut bacteria, in this case, can harbor H. pylori, Helicobacter in some cases. To point this out here, they've shown that up to 50% of the people studied around the world actually harbor H. pylori. So it's in the gut of about half of the world's population, based on the estimates that they've done. But the vast majority don't actually develop the ulcers. So here you have in your gut a microbe that is known to cause ulcers. 50% of the world people carry it, but certainly not that many have ulcers. So what they're finding is that it's most likely a combination of carrying the bacteria and then inducing yourself with stress, poor diet, and probably genetic factors and things like that go along with it. So this is a good example of what I was talking about earlier, of where you can harbor a microbe that makes you sick, harbor a microbe that can make you sick. Healthy people consistently harbor known pathogens, but only in certain cases will it actually develop into an actual disease. So it was actually true what they were saying was that stress and poor diet and things like that caused the ulcer, but they just didn't have a full understanding. It's that in combination with the gut bacteria, which is why not everybody who's stressed and has poor diet ultimately gets an ulcer. So that's an example of a gut microbe and a fairly well-established disease there that relates to that concept. So the H. pylori, as well as some others I'll mention here on the next slide, these are new links to old microbes. Excuse me, they are new links to old microbes. They are examples of diseases that have been previously established, but linked to causes that had previously gone unknown. And as I mentioned earlier, it's much easier to diagnose a symptom and oftentimes even to treat it than it is to understand what caused it in the first place. And for many years, science and medicine were much better at diagnosing and even treating than they were at understanding the root cause. So that's still the case for the most part, by the way, but their scientists are getting better, and a lot of the breakthroughs are coming from a better understanding of the human microbiome. Many of these unknown causes are now being associated with gut bacteria and the human microbiome. Now, some of those may not pan out. I think in some cases they may be it may be exaggerated what effect they have. No one really knows for sure because the research is ongoing and currently trying to figure these things out. These are not well established, but there's a ton of clues. You'll read some of the online articles throughout the semester that you'll see what I'm talking about. Lots of evidence to suggest that this is what's happening, but odds are they won't all pan out, and they'll probably turn out to be a wide variety of factors. But certainly there's going to be a number of diseases that are associated with our gut bacteria and other microbes that currently or previously were just completely unknown. Here's a couple of examples in addition to the H. pylori and stomach ulcers. I've got an article I'll have you read about OCD, Obsessive Compulsive Disorder, and strep throat infection. There's actually a wider syndrome called Pediatric Autoimmune Neuropsychiatric Disorders associated with streptococcal infections, better known as PANDAS. That's a little more controversial. Not everybody agrees on that one. But there's a group of scientists who believe that certain sorts of behavioral disorders, is really what that comes down to, can be associated with strep throat infection. Now, whether that is absolutely true, partially true, or maybe completely false, at least some scientists believe that there is an association between certain strains of strep throat bacteria and especially during certain age, certain points of development in a child's life. Usually early on, I'm thinking it's like somewhere around the age of 3 to 5 years old. If you end up with a certain strain of the infection, a certain strain of the strep throat at a certain point in time, these scientists believe that it could actually change your behavior in a way that leads to a set of symptoms like obsessive compulsive disorder. They also think it might be like ADHD and things like that. Again, not everybody agrees on that, but there's at least some people who believe that, and they actually have some compelling evidence to make their case. You'll have an article you can read about that. Multiple sclerosis, MS, is thought to be triggered, at least in some cases, by the soil bacterium called Clostridium perfringens. We'll read about that one later in the semester in our lab. We'll do some research on this one. Probably not all cases are caused by this, but they think it has the potential to cause MS-like symptoms. Cancer, for sure, is one. Now, this one's almost really not even debatable. It's just a matter of how many different cancers are caused by microbes. So, without a doubt, some of them are. One of the better known is the HPV virus, the human papillomavirus, which can cause cervical cancer. So, that one is well known. Many others are also well known, but like, for example, hepatitis C, which can cause liver cancer and liver disease. Probably many others that cause cancer as well. Obesity, this is another one that initially was more controversial, but over the last 10 years, I've yet to see a study that's done that refutes this. So it's becoming more common knowledge than it is a debatable topic. It's now pretty well established that your gut bacteria will affect the way your body gains and retains weight. And I've got some online articles you can read about this. Very fascinating. I've done studies with twins, identical twins, that one was overweight, one was underweight. They studied the gut bacteria and found there were differences that they could attribute to the difference. So they found that your gut bacteria will have an effect on the way your body gains and loses weight. We all know people, maybe you, have a really hard time losing weight, have a really hard time gaining weight. It goes both ways. And while genetic factors are certainly partly responsible, without a doubt, your genetics are part of the equation. Probably maybe even a bigger part of the equation is the gut bacteria. Unfortunately, I haven't seen any supplements or any sort of remedies to come out of it yet, although there may be out there. I honestly haven't looked, but I've not heard of any. but they found definitely a link between your gut bacteria and your overall body type. Also, they found that kids who take lots of antibiotics at a young age are more likely to be overweight later in life and to stay overweight. So obviously there's a lot of factors that can make someone lose and gain weight, right? So this is obviously a complex topic, so you can never associate it to one thing. But as a trend, your gut bacteria will affect that ability to gain and lose weight. Obviously, if you eat 100 calories a day and you run a mile each day, you're not going to gain much weight, right? But the gut bacteria are going to be a factor in how easily it is for you to gain and lose weight. This last one down here, probably the most controversial on the list, autism. No one's suggesting that all cases of autism are caused by bacteria or that even there is a case to be made here, but there is some interesting research indicating that it's possible that certain types of infection during certain stages of pregnancy could actually increase the likelihood of a child being born with autism. The more compelling evidence I've seen is in relation to higher body temperatures, or fever rather, during pregnancy. I just Googled this real quick so you can see what I mean. If you want to find, I just typed in fever and autism. If you want to look up some of these, you're more than welcome, obviously. But they're finding that autism risk is increased for women who have high fevers during certain periods of their pregnancy. Now, whether that's directly related to certain microbes or whether it's just the fever, more research is ongoing there. So it's possible that in hindsight they'll look back and find that that was either partly responsible or maybe entirely responsible for symptoms of autism. So all sorts of fascinating stuff going on in the world of microbiology and how it relates to human health, more so than most people realize. One of the last things here before we get into emerging diseases, microbes and behavior. And I have another article that you'll read about this, because a lot of this stuff is just better described from outside sources than our textbook. So microbes are now being linked to things like depression, anxiety, your attention span, like ADD and ADHD, even your overall energy levels. Chronic fatigue syndrome, for example, is being linked to gut bacteria. Also your overall diet. They have found that in mice, in lab mice, which obviously are different than people, but comparable, they found that you can transfer the certain personality traits simply by transferring gut bacteria. So for example, calm mice can be induced to become anxious with a simple gut bacteria transfer, and vice versa. So in mice, the great thing is you can control all the variables as to where they go, what they eat, what they don't eat, how much they eat, what kind of bacteria they have in their gut. You can actually control that fairly well. And they found that by simply keeping all the variables the same and changing the gut bacteria, the personality and the characteristics of the mice would actually change in relationship with those gut bacteria. So you take a calm mice, and by the way, they would study the mice and they would say, okay, they would show that a calm mouse had a different gut bacteria than an anxious mouse. So they would show a difference to begin with, which is important. And then they would find that when they switched them, the characteristic would go along with the switch. So the calm mouse would have its bacteria transferred to the anxious mouse and vice versa, and those traits of calm and anxiousness would actually go with them. So very, very compelling evidence. That doesn't mean that it's the case in humans. Humans are obviously more complicated, and we don't control variables, so there's lots of things happening in our life. But in a vacuum, it's been shown that the gut bacteria can affect the overall energy levels and the overall attention span of mice that are controlled in that environment. So certainly something that they are continuing to look into, something that we all as people should take note of. Going back to the high fiber, low sugar diet, if you're highly anxious, if you have a low attention span, if you have issues sleeping, if you have depression, if you have anxiety, before you start taking, and I'm not a doctor, but before you start taking lots of pills, you might try a new diet. High fiber diet could be all it takes to get you back on track. Okay, next here is emerging diseases, our last topic here. Emerging disease is just anything that has appeared in a population for the first time or that may have existed previously but it's rapidly increasing. So in other words, it's something that we've never seen or it's been a while and it's kind of coming back. That's actually technically called a reemerging disease, but it kind of all falls into the same category of emerging diseases. And this is essentially the wild card in microbiology that is unpredictable. There's always something around the corner that we don't know that could be either the next big outbreak, or it could just be the next rare disease that people pick up from time to time. So in hindsight, it's always easy to identify what at one point was an emerging disease. So some of the examples have been Ebola. We had an Ebola outbreak actually not that long ago. I believe it was 2013 or so. Swine flu back in, I think, 2007. SARS was early 2000s. Enterovirus, that was sometime in the early 2010 or 2012, something like that. That was a polio-like virus that wasn't very many, but it was an outbreak that occurred in California that caused pretty serious issues in kids who were infected, unfortunately. But the idea is that these are all diseases that you just don't see coming, and once they hit, people have to react. There's no anticipation in order to kind of prevent them from happening. So that's the idea behind emerging diseases. Real quick, I pull up a example. Just recently, there's been several emerging tick-borne diseases. Now, I haven't had a chance to sit down and read this yet, so I'm going to try and put together some new articles this semester over these so you can get to know a little bit more about them. Tick diseases are expected to continue to go up over time as the geographic range of ticks slowly starts to increase. So there's some new information here that I will try and get put together for you this semester. Now, one of the types of emerging diseases are antibiotic resistant strains of bacteria. I talked about MRSA earlier in chapter 1, part 1, as a type of staph bacteria that's resistant to antibiotics. So that's I wouldn't necessarily say it's emerging as of this moment. We've known about it for quite some time. But what makes it still somewhat emerging is that it becomes resistant over time to different drugs. So while it remains antibiotic resistant kind of over time, it can gradually increase the number of different drugs it's resistant to. So in that sense, you may have a drug that treats it today, and then tomorrow it no longer works. And so in that sense, it is kind of like an emerging disease in which it's no longer treatable because it continues to evolve against the drugs that we use. Another one is drug-resistant gonorrhea. I do have an article for you to read about this one. Drug-resistant gonorrhea has been increasing somewhat rapidly, and they now have they've documented patients who died from gonorrhea within recent time simply because there was no drugs that they could treat it with. So that's not common as of now, but it's on the rise, and these things are expected to get worse before they get better, unfortunately. The big issue with antibiotics is that as we use antibiotics, bacteria develop resistance to them. Now, some of you may be familiar with this concept, but it is a kind of a Darwinian evolutionary concept based on survival of the fittest. So when it comes to the bacteria in our body, there are often trillions of these bacteria, at least hundreds of millions of each strain. So many. And every time we use a drug, we kill off all these susceptible strains, but leave behind some of the resistant strains. And in certain circumstances, those resistant strains can repopulate the body and leave behind a population that is resistant to that drug. So the next time you go to use that drug, it may no longer work, or even during the same course of infection, it may lead to an infection that it no longer responds to the antibiotics that are being given. And really, based on this concept, it comes down to the more you use antibiotics, the more you create resistant strains of bacteria. It really is a numbers game. It's kind of like winning the lottery. As long as somebody's playing the lottery, it's just a matter of time before somebody wins. Even though the odds of winning are very slim, under high levels of playing, when 100 million people enter into the lottery, It's just a matter of time before one person wins it. So it really comes down to a game of probability. So the more times we use an antibiotic, and due to the large number of bacteria, it really just becomes a matter of time before we start to select for the resistant strains that naturally occur in every population. So ultimately, higher use of antibiotics leads to higher rates of resistance, and ultimately the drugs become less effective or completely ineffective over time. This has been something that the CDC and the World Health Organization have expressed concern about for at least 15, almost 20 years. And unfortunately, the doctors who prescribe these have continued to prescribe them. It is getting better, it seems like, as of recently. People are starting to, I think, finally listen. But there's still doctors who give too many antibiotics. There's still countries that don't have regulations on antibiotics. And the problem will continue to get worse before it gets better. So a couple quick questions here. How long have scientists known about antibiotic resistance in bacteria? And then the second is, what activities increase antibiotic resistance? So the first one, how long have scientists known about antibiotic resistance in bacteria? And the answer is, since the discovery of antibiotics. It was known right off the bat, very early on. It turns out that bacteria had already developed resistance before we even discovered antibiotics. Now, we'll talk more about antibiotics later in the semester in our lab. We'll do an antibiotic lab, and I'll have you read what the nature of antibiotics is. We'll talk about that throughout the semester. I'll mention it just real quick without all the detail here, and you can look this up if you're curious in the short term. Essentially, antibiotics come from nature. So antibiotics come from Mother Nature. I like to use that word a lot. At the same time, resistance to antibiotics evolved from Mother Nature. So in other words, the very mechanisms of resistance go hand in hand with the actual antibiotics themselves. Antibiotics are essentially compounds that are made by microbes to kill other microbes. Humans didn't invent antibiotics. We simply discovered them. So these are actually produced oftentimes by bacteria as a means of killing off the competition from other bacteria. Sometimes they're produced by fungi to kill off other fungi or bacteria. So they're basically a microbial weapon that's used against other species around them. And they do this to give themselves a competitive advantage for sources of nutrients. So if you're a bacteria in the soil and you can kill off most of the other bacteria around you, you have an advantage to getting more nutrients, you have an advantage to grow more proficiently, and over time your species is more likely to survive. At the very same time, if you can counteract the effect of another microbe, then you have the ability to withstand their effect and therefore counteract that to your own benefit. So antibiotics themselves and the resistance to those antibiotics have been around long before we ever even knew what they were or that they were even a thing. So antibiotic resistance developed before we knew about them. So how long have we known about it? Since the discovery of antibiotics. It was a relatively short period of time thereafter that they realized that in some cases they wouldn't work, and they figured out that that was due to the resistance. What activities increase antibiotic resistance? This one's a little bit easier. A lot of you probably already know this, and that is overuse and misuse. So overuse and misuse. Now those two things, you can parse those out, but in general, I think hopefully you probably know what I'm talking about there. Prescribing them when you don't need to prescribe them, taking them for the wrong reason, taking too many, not taking enough, things of that nature. Okay, next here I want to show a couple things about some of the trends with antibiotic resistance, and we're getting close to the end here, so we'll be about done. one of the really, it's kind of frustrating. It's just really a problem more than it is anything. Is that while antibiotic resistance has been going up, the development of new drugs to replace the old ones has been going down. So we have two trends that are both heading in the wrong direction. So here on the left, we see a chart showing, this is a little bit dated, but unfortunately the numbers are still heading in this direction. We see that resistance of antibiotic resistance has been going up and up and up and up. So that's what this is showing here. And then on the right, we see the number of antibiotics approved by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration around the same time period, and it's going down, 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 down. So we have resistance going up, but the drugs to combat that going down. So you think, well, what in the hell is going on here? If resistance is going up, why aren't companies making more drugs to fight this? Why would they not do that? And the unfortunate answer as to why companies aren't developing more drugs, why aren't drug companies developing more new antibiotics, the unfortunate answer comes down to money, cost of development, and long-term profit. Basically, all the drug companies are for-profit corporations. So pharmaceutical companies, not sure if I spelled that right. Pharmaceutical companies are for-profit corporations. Now I'm not trying to say that that's a bad thing. It just is what it is. Okay, so you can hate on that or whatever. It is what it is. What that means is that their primary motivation is to make money. Love it or hate it. Their primary motivation is not to save the world. Their primary motivation is not to rid the world of antibiotic resistance and to make drugs to save everybody. Their primary motivation, as is the case with all for-profit corporations, is to make money. Now, it would be fantastic if they could do both. I have zero doubt that the vast majority of them would love to save the world and would love to make money at the same time. The problem is those two things don't always go hand in hand. The real issue when it comes to antibiotics is that compared to other drugs, for example, like hair loss medications, erectile dysfunction medications, cholesterol reducing medications, you name it, blood pressure medications, diabetes medication, that can go on. The profit and the long-term profit from these drugs is significantly less. So antibiotics make less money over time compared to these other types of drugs. They cost about the same amount to develop, and they take about the same amount of time to develop. So the cost up front is similar, but the long-term profit is significantly less, because ultimately antibiotics have a relatively short-lived profit window, quote unquote. I think that's an actual term. Hopefully you know what I mean there. You're not going to make money off an antibiotic for 50 years because eventually the drug will become less effective as resistance develops. So any antibiotic is going to have a relatively short-lived profit window. So as a for-profit company who's trying to figure out how to make the most amount of money, these drugs are just not ideal because there's other drugs that are going to make going to net you a higher yield of return over that long period of time. It takes a lot of money and a lot of time to develop any drug. So the amount of time and effort that it takes to develop a drug really forces companies to go towards drugs that are going to provide a higher yield of return over time. Antibiotics definitely don't fit that description. So as a result, more and more companies have gone away from producing antibiotics because they don't yield them the return on their profit that they're looking for. And again, their primary motivation is to make money, not to save the world. It is only if they can do both that works out for them. So if you can't make money while you're saving the world, then unfortunately Most of them choose not to do that. Some do. I'm not saying they're all the same, but that's the trend that you're seeing here, unfortunately. So that is a reason why we have fewer drugs available today to treat antibiotic infection, and why the CDC and the World Health Organization, as I mentioned here, have expressed great concern. It's not just that we have antibiotic resistance, it's that we have antibiotic resistance in combination with fewer alternatives to treat those. It's an alarming trend. They are slowly starting to figure out ways, or I should say they're coming up with, let me rephrase that, they're starting to realize that they need to do something about it. Last I heard, they were trying to come up with ways to incentivize pharmaceutical companies to develop these drugs, but I've not heard anything real promising that's come from that. The government, to be fair, is slowly starting to address the issue, but I don't know what exactly is going to come of that. So, last thing is about what are some of the things that cause antibiotic resistance. These are just a couple diagrams, so let me explain these here for you. One of the major issues of antibiotic resistance comes from the overuse. Remember, that was one of the things, overuse. This actually technically would qualify as misuse too, in my opinion. Overuse and misuse as it relates to livestock and animals that are raised for human consumption. Something like 70 to 80%, according to this here, 80% of antibiotics in the US are used for livestock, not for human consumption. So here we see almost 60% goes into livestock feed, 13% goes into livestock water. So you're looking at almost 75% simply in their food and water. Injection would probably be for medical treatment, and other, who knows, could be anything. So you're looking right here at about 75% of all antibiotics are simply just put into the feed of livestock animals. Now, why would they do that? It turns out, well, there's two reasons. It turns out, one, that when you put antibiotics in the food of animals like pigs and cows especially, they put on more weight. So it's a really clever way to actually increase the overall net weight of an animal without having to necessarily feed it any additional grain. So you can actually bulk up an animal by simply putting antibiotics in its food. I'm not sure exactly why that works. I think there's speculation, but it's been known for quite some time that that works pretty well. So ultimately, antibiotics are really cheap, especially those in livestock. You can get big bags of cheap antibiotics in the agricultural world, put it in your food, and for a little bit of antibiotic, you can get a relatively large return on the animal in terms of a larger mass and more money when you slaughter it and sell it. So basically, it's a way to beef up the animals to make more money off of them. The unfortunate side effect of that is that it rapidly accelerates antibiotic resistance. At least that's what scientists are estimating. I've got another article on this for you that you'll read sometime this semester. It's a little bit harder to prove. One of the things the article talks about is the fact that many of these livestock producers don't allow researchers in to even test this. So it is difficult to prove it definitively, simply because they're being blacklisted, from getting in to do the research to show what they believe is happening. So what research they have done confirms this, but it's not been sufficient to really prove it. So it's interesting because scientists claim this is what's happening, and then the livestock industry says, well, you can't prove it. And they say, yeah, because you refuse to let us do the testing. So it is kind of a game that they're playing, unfortunately. But the idea is that you give these antibiotics to the animals, that causes the resistant strains within the animals, and then those bacteria ultimately get shed in the waste, and the wastewater and the animal waste from these farms. It can get transferred to the workers. It can end up in the meat that you actually eat, and it can get transferred to other animals. Eventually, that can end up on fruits and vegetables. It can end up being passed from one worker to another. You can theoretically pick it up from the food that you eat, and all of these things can take that from the animals to various intermediates into the general population. Again, that's at least the theory. Seems to be a pretty viable hypothesis. However, they haven't been able to prove that definitively. What they have shown is that almost all the almost all the food that you buy at the store has trace amounts of antibiotics in it. Now, whether that's enough to cause resistance is another question. It's actually probably not. So if you eat chicken with antibiotics in it, it's not likely to cause resistance in your body, but it just is proof that there's antibiotics circulating around in various places. So that's how it's thought to ultimately cause issues outside of the farm, because a lot of the agriculturists or the livestock producers, they claim that there's no effect outside of the animals, and again, difficult to prove, but it just doesn't appear to be the case. It appears that there actually is an effect outside the farm. So you've probably seen a lot of places, like McDonald's was a big one. They're now going to antibiotic free food. So I do think that there has been a market demand for food without antibiotics, and that should actually be enough to make a significant change over time. So if more people are looking for food without those, the producers will respond in a way to give it to them. The only downside is it tends to cost a little bit more, because one of the ways you get cheaper meat is by pumping the animals full of antibiotics. So the downside is resistance. The upside, though, to be fair, is you can get cheaper meat that way. It's one of the ways you can reduce the cost of your food. Last little bit here is some of the misuse of antibiotics. This is starting to change, but there are a lot of infections that are treated with antibiotics that don't need antibiotics. And so this is just a quick little pie chart showing some of the different types. So sinus infections, middle ear infections, pharyngitis, upper respiratory infections. A lot of these things are actually either due to allergies or viruses in many cases, and viruses don't respond to antibiotics. We'll talk about that in chapter 6. Viruses, you give antivirals, or you just let the immune system take care of it. So in most cases, you probably don't need to do anything, but you really don't need to be given antibiotics. Okay, now that's not always quite so black and white. There's arguments against that, but in many cases, it's not necessary to give antibiotics. So here you see gray, antibiotics were necessary about half the time, and in red, should have never given antibiotics in the first place. So once again, you're overusing and misusing, and that increases the rates of resistance and makes the problem worse. So that's an issue with in human medicine and doctors for overprescribing. Now, just to clarify before I finish up here, I'm not trying to throw doctors under the bus. They have a very difficult job. I don't envy them. I know that they have good intentions in most cases. So it is simply a matter-of-fact issue. I'm not here to point the finger or blame doctors as if they're doing it on purpose or anything like that. It's just a matter-of-fact deal. They're overprescribing, and it's something that is leading to higher rates of antibiotic resistance. So it is starting to change. I do think people are starting to get the message, and I do think that over time it will start to get better. The big question, really, just to wrap this up here, the big question is going to be, are we going to get new antibiotics in the near future? Because ultimately, no matter how much we use or misuse them, eventually the drugs that we have today will lose their effectiveness. Even if we use them as carefully as we can, eventually they will become less and less effective to the point that they're not effective at all. So the question is how long can we prolong each drug? Okay, so no matter what you do, eventually you'll need new drugs. So the ultimate million-dollar question is, are we going to get new antibiotics in the near future? And are they going to come soon enough to help combat some of the resistance that we're seeing that's popping up faster and faster? Okay, that is the end of chapter 1. So since it's the first chapter, let me just go ahead and say this here. Make sure to email me if you have any questions, and or bring those questions to class. Write those down, and I'll be happy to answer those during class. Or if you want to email me, or stop by the office, and you can talk about it in person if you'd like. Just make sure you let me know if you have questions, or if I didn't explain something right, or if I left you hanging on something, you want more information, just let me know. But don't keep it to yourself. If you're struggling, you got to let me know. Otherwise, I can't help you. All right? Have a great day, and I will see you next time we meet in class. Goodbye.